Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. In this episode, we're going to be taking a look at Alle Menschen müssen sterben, which translates to Everybody Must Die, a very morbid title, and the lyrics that follow that same theme, so definitely a very grim text that Bach set in this particular chorale, and it's fitting that we are in a minor key. So we're just going to hop right into it. It's a pretty straightforward chorale. No key signature. We start on A minor and we end on A major, as Bach often does in minor chorales. So I reckon we're in the key of A minor. After our tonic triad, we have G sharp, B, E, and B. That's E major over G sharp, which is our dominant and first inversion. And then we have A minor, A, E, and C. Another tonic triad. Probably the most common progression you'll find at the beginning of a chorale. 1, 5, 6, 1. We then have E, G sharp, E, and B. That's E major in root position. That's a 5 chord. Passing 7th in the alto before we get F, A, C, and A. That's F major in root position. So we have a deceptive progression here of 5 going to 6. We also have a passing 7th in the bass. And as we're closing in on our half cadence in the key of A minor, we have D, A, F, and B natural. Very interesting here. That would imply B minor 7 flat 5 over D, which is in the key of A minor 7, 6, 5, kind of an unusual chord here. You could make the argument that this is kind of like a 4 chord if you look at this B as an accented non-chord tone, so definitely a chord that you would more likely find in a cadential situation, but the chord does resolve to 1, which is where we would expect it to go. A, E, and C, which is A minor, and then it goes to E, so maybe it's not as unusual as I would think. It's just kind of an uncommon chord. You don't see 7, 6, 5 all that often. And after 1 we have E major, E, G sharp, E, and B, which is our 5 chord. And interestingly, we actually follow up our half cadence with another half cadence in the key of A minor. No modulations just yet. We have A, E, and C. That's another A minor triad in root position. E, G sharp, E, and B. That's an E major triad in root position with the passing 7th in the bass. And then we have A minor in first inversion. C, A, E, and A, which is our tonic triad in first inversion. We have a passing tone here in the alto, which spells out some melodic minor going on. And then we have B, D, G sharp, and B, which is G sharp diminished over B. That's 7, 6. 1, 6, 7, 6. If you've watched my videos in the past, you could probably guess what chord's going to come next. We're expecting a tonic triad, and that's what we get. A, E, A, and C. 1, 6, 7, 6, 1, or the inverse. Probably, maybe it's even the most common progression, when I say progression, probably the most common hallmark progression of the chorales. We see this and variations of 1, 6, 7, 6, 1 all throughout Bach's chorales. Passing 7th in the bass, this C is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. We then have F, F, B, and D. Now if we analyze that literally, that is B diminished over F, which is 7, 6, 4, but kind of similarly to, actually I don't know where I was going with that. I was imagining that we saw a similar scenario beforehand. I think this B is an accented non-chord tone actually, and we're actually looking at A here. F, F, A, and D, which makes a lot more sense. That's D minor over F, which is 4, 6, and in a cadential situation this makes a lot more sense because we're expecting, you know what, I just realized something. Why did I call this 7, 6? This is not 7, 6. Of course it's not 7, 6. This is 2, 6, 5. B diminished is 7 in the key of C, not in the key of A. I'm so sorry that I made that mistake. This is 2, 6, 5, and it's half diminished, which makes a ton more sense than 7 because we're in a cadential situation. However, we do have 2 going to 1, which is an interesting step that we take. Maybe 4 is what's being implied here, but ultimately in a cadential situation this 1 chord's kind of just serving, I guess, as an intermediary between 2 and 5. We would expect 2 and 1 to it's an unlikely progression. We do see it sometimes, but 2 going to 1 doesn't really have the same heft as a dominant preceding 1 does, for example, or 4 going to 1. But I guess, 2 and 4 are used pretty interchangeably, so why can't 2 go to 1? There's no reason why 2 can't go to 1, it's just an unlikely progression, and there's usually other contextual tones that tell a more complex story or an entirely different story. So 2-6-4 or 4-6, that's more along the lines of the chords that we would expect in a half cadential situation. We have another E major triad here, E, B, G sharp, and E. That's a 5 chord, and it's more specifically as a Phrygian half cadence because we have a 4-6 going to 5 where we have the flat 6 going to the 5 and the bass. That half step is typical of the Phrygian mode. It's the only mode, I guess really the only mode that got use or gets use. I need to be careful with the words that I use. The Locrian mode also gets used. There are 2 modes that have a half step between the first and second degrees of the pitch collection, the Phrygian mode and the Locrian mode. But the Locrian mode, because its tonic triad is diminished, it does not have, it's not a very favorable pitch collection to, it's not a favorable pitch collection to be used in Bach, or was favorable pitch collection to be used during Bach's time because of the fact that it was very, very dissonant and their ears were a little bit more, it wasn't stylistically expected. Got a little jumbled there, apologies for the rant, but yes, 4-6 going to 5, much more common, and it's a Phrygian half cadence. We've seen these countless times before. Looking ahead to the B section, we have a perfect authentic cadence in the key of G major. Starting things off with E, E, G sharp, and B. That's another 5 chord, no need to reanalyze. We then have A minor, A, E, A, and C, which is our tonic triad where we would expect 5 to go to, and I think this is our pivot chord to the key of G major because A minor also happens to be our supertonic in the key of G major. Passing 7th in the bass before we get F sharp, D, A, and D, which is D major over F sharp. We're already seeing good, a good normative progression here, 2 going to 5. Passing 7th in the melody before we get G major in root position, G, D, G, and B, which is our tonic triad. Now that we're in the key of G, we also have a passing 7th in the bass before we get E, C, G, and C, which is C major in first inversion, that's 4-6. Passing tone in the bass and in the tenor before we get C, E, G, and B. Now we could make the argument that this is a 4-7 chord. Actually, we don't need to reiterate the Roman numeral because it's being preceded by it. We could just change the figured bass to reflect that it is a 7 chord that is in root position. But I think this B is an accented non-chord tone, and this is actually A minor 7 over C, which is 2-6-5. This is a much more likely chord that we would find in a cadential situation. Not to say that 4-7 isn't a chord that we could also find in a cadential situation, but it's more likely for us to find it. A 2-6-5 chord, because we know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords. Case in point, our first phrase. But then we have D, A, F sharp, and A, which is D major. That's our dominant. We have a passing tone in the... We just have an embellishing figure here. This B is a non-chord tone, this C is a 7th, but also not a chord tone in the context of what we hear on the downbeat, so we'll mark it as a embellishing tone, some type of non-chord tone, and then we cadence on G major, G, B, D, and G. Tonic triad, root position. Okay, looking ahead, we have an interesting phrase, probably the most interesting phrase of the whole chorale. It concludes with a perfect authentic cadence in the key of E. You might be looking ahead and you might see a G sharp here and might be wondering what's going on if this is a perfect authentic cadence. Well, that is a Picardy third to spoil what's going on at the end of this phrase. But we start off in G major. We have G, D, G, and B. That's our tonic triad. And when I analyze, I reiterate the Roman numeral when we are going to a new line. So even though it's the same Roman numeral, I'll repeat it just because it's a new line. Our eyes move. It shows that there is continuity as opposed to something like, let's see, is there an instance where we use the same Roman numeral? No, not in the chorale so far, but if I see the same Roman numeral twice, I will just not analyze the second instance of it or the third instance of it, however many repetitions there are, unless there's a new line involved. We have a passing 7th in the bass, a neighbor tone in the alto before we get E, E, G, and B. That's E minor in root position, which is a 6 chord, and I think that's also our indication that we're moving to the key of E minor. It's now our tonic. We have a passing tone in the alto and a passing 7th in the bass before we get C, A, E, and A, which is A minor over C. That is a 4/6 chord. Passing tone in the bass, passing tone in the tenor before we get A, C, E, and G. That's taking our A minor chord and putting it in root position, and also adding a 7th. Kind of interesting how we're seeing this chord progression again. Maybe that kind of strengthens the argument that this is in fact a 4/7 chord. Bach has been known to repurpose chord progressions across keys. We do see consistency in that across tons of the chorales. But I don't think this is what it is, because here it's happening at a different point metrically. But we will see this progression again later in the chorale, so maybe I should be favoring this 7/5/3 analysis over the 2/6/5, who knows. The chord is there, that's why I offer varying perspectives, because the analysis I think can go in either way, and I think both analyses are correct. Following our A minor 7 chord, we have B, F sharp, D sharp, and F sharp, which is B major in root position. That's our dominant. We have a passing 7th in the bass before we get G, B, E, and G. It's E minor in first inversion, 1/6. Passing tone in the bass before we get B, B, D sharp, and F sharp. It's another dominant triad with the passing 7th in the tenor, and then we cadence not on E minor, but E major. And typically when we see a major or a Picardy third used in a minor cadence or a minor authentic cadence in the middle of the chorale, we know that typically this chord is going to be repurposed as the dominant of the key that we're moving to. And what makes this phrase particularly interesting is two things. One, the chord is reiterated. We see another E major chord repeated right afterwards, so it's just introducing the idea, and it is then repeated, which typically does not happen. We usually just see the major triad and then the movement to, in this case, A minor or whatever key this would be the dominant of. But after the repetition is where the modulation is going to happen. So A minor, this would be 5, E, G sharp, E, and B, just another E major triad with some voice rotation. And then we go to A minor, A, E, and C, which is our tonic triad in root position. However, if we look ahead, we have a perfect authentic cadence in the key of C major, which is really interesting because I think that this is the extent of our visitation to A minor. And what you might be thinking is, well, if we are only moving to the key of A minor for 2 beats, why am I calling it a modulation when it could just as easily be called a tonicization? Well, if we're analyzing this chorale linearly, which I think is a fair thing to do and is how it's generally how I analyze, where I'm not really, generally speaking, taking into account what's happening well into the distance, right? We don't really know that we're going to cadence in C major until the end. After we hear this E major triad, the logical conclusion is not that we're moving to the key of C major, it's that we're moving to the key of E minor. So the only thing that's keeping this from being a tonicization is where it occurs metrically in the phrase. It's the first thing we hear. We hear 5 going to 1 in the key of A minor. Therefore, I believe we're in the key of A minor at this point rather than the key of C major, even though this A minor chord is also functioning as our pivot chord to the key of C major, or at least that's the way that I hear it. That's just how it is for me. You could also analyze this in the key of C major and say that this is 5 of 6 and that this chord right here is 6. That analysis just looks a little bit too foreshadowing to me. That's an analysis based on the fact that you know what's going to happen after the fact, whereas this analysis is analyzing the chorale in the order in which the events are heard. So I think both analyses are accurate. Mine just, like I said, if I didn't justify it clearly enough, you could rewind the video and listen to it again. It's just so I don't have to repeat for a second or third time. But yes, this A minor chord is now our submediant in the key of C major with a passing 7th in the bass. We then have F, B, G, and D, kind of an interesting chord. This is G7 in third inversion, so 5-4-2. We haven't seen a 5-4-2 or just a 4-2 chord in general in a couple of episodes, or more than a couple of episodes. I can't recall analyzing a 4-2 chord in a while. Not that they're super uncommon or anything, but the way that this 4-2 chord resolves is relatively uncommon. The seventh resolves down by step, which is where we would expect it to go. However, we would typically expect a tonic triad in first inversion after this chord, but if we look at the chord that we have on the downbeat here, we have D, C, G, and E, and this D is an accented non-chord tone, leaving us with this C right here as our chord tone. So we have a 5-4-2 chord that actually resolves to a tonic triad in root position, despite the fact that the bass does continue in the direction that we would expect, which is down by step. And as we're closing in on our cadence, we have G, C, G, and D. We know that a 5 chord's being implied here, but the C is a 4-3 suspension over the bass. This D right here where the alto and the tenor are singing the same note, that's kind of interesting, but we have some counterpoint going on. This D is just delaying the resolution of the suspension, or ornamenting the suspension, before we get G, B, E, and D. So kind of interesting, we get like an E minor 7 chord over G, but this E is an accented non-chord tone, and really what we're looking at is this F right here that kind of happens at the same time as this C. So I guess you could make the argument, there'd be a relatively strong argument, that 5/7's being implied here, even though C is also occurring at the same time. So like I've mentioned in previous episodes at length, the cadences in the chorales tend to be very contrapuntal. So it's not uncommon for us to have to think outside of the box and sort of force a perspective onto the chord to pick apart what's actually happening harmonically, because if you look at literally what's happening on every downbeat and picking apart the harmonies that arise from the counterpoint, you don't always have a chord that matches the function of what's going on or what is actually contributing to the chord progression. That's one of the difficult parts of just contrapuntal music in general, is just picking out what is part of the function and what is sort of like superfluous or like auxiliary, just tones that are adding to the texture that are not part of the harmonic narrative. But regardless, we have a 5 chord going to a 1 chord. This is a pretty typical perfect authentic cadence, C, C, E, and C, which is implying a tonic triad. We just don't have the 5th. That's totally fine. And as we are moving towards the key of A minor, we have a perfect authentic cadence in the key of A minor at the end of this chorale, but we don't modulate immediately directly. We do wait an extra beat. We have C, C, G, and E. That's C major in root position. We have a passing 7th in the bass and a passing tone in the tenor before we get A, E, C, and E, kind of evoking memories of the second phrase in the B section, because we have 1 going to 6, just like we do here, and this A minor chord, which is 6 in the key of C major, also happens to be our tonic in the key of A minor, and you're going to see that actually the chord progression mirrors that of at least the beginning of the of this phrase, the beginning of the second system. So we have F, F, A, and D, which is D minor in first inversion. G sharp is a passing tone, or sorry, not a passing tone, a neighbor tone. We also have another neighbor tone in the bass before we get F, A, and C. Now we could make the argument that this is a 6 chord, but I think this F is not an accented non-chord tone, but this D right here needs to be lumped into the greater chordal analysis, and this is actually a D minor 7 in root position. So 7, 5, 3. Same thing as what's going on here, but because the bass is just marginally more active than what's going on in the bass in this measure right here, we kind of had to force a little bit of a perspective there, but when you can extrapolate all of the notes to create continuity between the different phrases to demonstrate, or not to demonstrate, Bach is the one who's doing the demonstration, but to illustrate the fact that there's patterns going on. it's very clear that Bach is using patterns and recycling material and transforming material to generate new material. That was his compositional process, was to take an idea or like a seed and then nurture it as it grows, rather than through composing everything, right? He was a transformative composer in that way. I think that can be attributed to the majority of his music. But regardless, we have E, E, A, and B. Similar to the cadence that we just saw, this is a 5 chord that's being implied, but we have a 4-3 suspension over the bass. This B is even ornamenting the suspension the same way it does in the tenor here. This B and this B, now the voices are an octave apart, but still they're both chord tones, so I don't need to mark them. And then we get the resolution, and it's interrupted by a voice that does not consist of a chord tone. But interestingly, we have C sharp and D natural, not D sharp. So we have a little like kind of, what would that be? Like A major sound, because the C sharp is foreshadowing the A major that's going to be happening here on this beat, on the final cadential chord on beat 3. So the C sharp, the only reason why it's here is because it is preceding the C sharp here, and he doesn't precede it by C natural and then goes to C sharp. I think that's an interesting gesture, but again, we have this anticipation in the melody that interrupts the 7 chord that technically could be analyzed as what's happening here, because we have E, D, G sharp, and B. And of course, our final chord, as it usually is a tonic triad in root position. We have A, C sharp, E, and A. And Bach often ends his minor chorales with the Picardy third. I imagine to just uplift those who are listening, because it's the last movement of the chorale, and he wants to send people off in a good, or the last movement. This movement is a chorale. It's the last movement of a cantata, and he wants to send people off in good spirits. At least that's what I like to imagine, but it's kind of hard to send people off in good spirits when the text is everybody must die. Kind of a gruesome setting. But on that note, thank you so much for watching the video. That is going to conclude today's analysis. All things considered, very straightforward. Nothing really threw me for too much of a loop. There are some sections where the chords are a little dicey, and as most chorales are, you typically get some parenthetical analysis, or that's how I analyze, is where if I'm unclear about something, or it's less about unclear and more about the fact that there are multiple ways to interpret what's going on the page. So if there are multiple interpretations of the material, I will offer varying perspectives, and that's what the parenthetical analysis is. So I think pretty much every chorale that I have analyzed has had some sort of parenthetical analysis, and even though this chorale is very straightforward, lots of 1s, lots of 5s, in fact lots of 1s and 5s, pretty much exclusively 1s and 5s with the occasional 2 or 4 chord. Oh, there's a 6 chord in there. And a couple of chords that you could analyze as 6 if you were very strict about where you were drawing your chord tones from. But still, very straightforward chorale. Not too much more to add than that. If you're interested in following me along on this journey to analyze the chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification icon so that you are notified of when my daily upload goes live. So if you want your daily fix of Bach, or your daily dose of analysis, or both, you're in the right place, and I'd be happy to have you along on the journey. But on that note, thank you so much for watching the video. Thank you so much for supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.